The last main thing that we need for creating working programs is a way of doing loops. So in C++, there's actually 3 different loops that you can use. I'm going to start with the most basic one, which is the while loop. So let's clear some of this out. Control K, there we go. So the most basic one is just keep going while something is true. So let's start with while input equals 5. Then I'm going to read in another one. So the idea is that I'm going to read in an input. If it's it's a 5, read in another one, print it out, read in another one, print it out, so on. Let's also print out here, just so I can see what it is. So save that. So let's put in a 5. So I get a 5. Notice that I'm still in the loop. It hasn't terminated yet. Do a 5 again, 4. All right. We have an extra printout from this guy here. So the idea is that while this statement is true, keep doing it over and over again. Now, something you should note about this is that if you first go into the loop and it's not true, so in this output here, I read in the input 2 that I entered, I print out the 2. I don't print it again because since it's not equal, it skips the entire loop the entire first time. So I don't ever execute the body of the while loop if it's not true to begin with. So it does the check before it actually executes the body of the code. Let's make this a little bit clearer. The for loop. Let's just make that part of this out. After loop. Notice I'm putting an extra space in here, so it'll print nicely. And then I'm going to go ahead and put a in loop. So just to make this a little clearer, if I do my example up above where I do 5, 5, 4, then before the loop it was a 5, in the loop it's a 5, so on. So if I do this, notice that it says before loop is a 2, after loop is a 2. It never got inside the loop itself. So what happens if you want to actually do this execution once before you do this while statement? So there's another loop that happens called a do while. So I'm going to alter this structure so it has the do while structure. So the way a do while works is that you have a do, your statements, and a while loop. By the way, one quick thing about while loops and do whiles, if you only have one statement, technically you don't need the braces. And that's basically true of all the looping and if statement structures. If there's only one, technically you don't need the braces, but it's probably a good idea to always put them in. So this loop will always execute inside the loop at least once. So if I go recompile this and run this example, and I do the 2, it does before the loop, in the loop, and after the loop. What just happened here? I should probably save this. That will help. So notice that it made me do the input again after I saved and ran this. So I did before the loop, then it forced me to do the loop once, so it asked me for the input again. Then it said I was in the loop, and then it showed me going out of the loop afterwards. So if you have to do it once, you can use a do while loop. Now there's a more advanced loop that will sometimes be used called a for loop. So let me go back to this one. I'm going to change this slightly so it says while input is less than or equal to 5, then do this loop over and over again. And I'm actually not going to read in the input. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to, at the end, add 1 each time. So notice here that while I'm in the loop, right after I do the output, well, after I print out what the input actually is, I'm going to add 1 to it. This is the shortcut for adding 1. I could have done input plus plus as well. And it's going to go through this while loop again. So if I do this one, so if I put in 2, for example, notice that before the loop it's 2, in the loop it's 2, 3, 4, 5, and it terminates once it's greater than 5. Now, the way this is actually working, I have this, the value of it beforehand, which I'm actually entering in here. I have the while loop that's happening, and I have this increment that happens. So it's going to happen over and over again, and generally speaking, I'm going to know how much this value is. Another thing I could do is, if I just wanted to count from 0 through 5, so if I do comment out the input, this just counts from 0 through 5. This is a pretty frequent thing that we do where we walk through, for example, everything in a list, and we want to print out each thing in the list. You want to start at the beginning of the list and go through until you reach the end, and add 1 each time to go increment through it. So we often have this pattern of we have some value we start at. While it's not the end of the thing that we're looking at, add 1 to it, or add some amount. You could add 5 or 10 or something. So this while loop, there's an equivalent to it, which is the for loop. So I'm going to leave that while loop up there, but let me show you what a for loop looks like. So I do a for loop. I do my first condition, this setting up the variable up here. I do the while condition, and I do the increment. So this thing has the same 3 parts I had up here, but it puts them all into one place. So I have this is called the initialization. I create my variable here. So it's basically this line there. Then I have a semicolon. Then I have my while part. So while input is less than 5. This is basically the while loop. It acts exactly like a while statement. And then once I go through my body of my code, I always at the very end run this, whatever this is. This is the incrementer. So for that code up above, this line, that is caps lock. Does exactly the same thing. So if I do, I'll leave that input up here just to make sure it's initialized. But if I comment out this while loop, notice it does exactly the same. And if you compare like the input from this while loop up here, input for the for loop, the only thing that changes, notice that this after loop 0 thing happens. I'm actually creating a temporary variable, also named input. It's actually different from this input out here. So this is a temporary one that gets created and only lives within the loop, and then gets thrown away once I reach this last brace. And so when I do this input, it's actually referring to this one up here, not this one in the loop. If I wanted to not do that, one thing I could do is that line there. Now it does exactly the same as this while loop did. So that's ways that you can walk through your code and do it over and over again.